Have you ever walked into a room? A room filled with people who share your blood, but not your heart, and the moment you step in you realize you weren't invited to be seen. You were invited to be erased. My name is Jessica. I'm 34, single mom, a former daughter. And on the day my father's will was read, they expected me to sit in silence, take the shame and disappear again. But what they didn't expect was my 8-year-old son, and the secret he'd been keeping for months. This is not a story about inheritance. It's a story about identity, about being forgotten, and then being found, not by others, but by the truth. The room was smaller than I remembered, but it felt enormous, with all the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. Overhead lights buzzed softly. A ticking clock echoed like a verdict. Every chair was filled, every face familiar. And yet, I'd never felt more like a stranger. I walked in holding my son's hand. Tyler looked up at me, his big, curious eyes scanning the room. He didn't ask why no one smiled. He didn't flinch when my sister said, "Guess you finally ran out of pride." I just squeezed his hand tighter, because I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew something had shifted. What no one at that table knew was that my father, the man they all claimed to understand, had left behind something more powerful than any dollar amount. And the person he trusted to reveal it wasn't a lawyer. It was my son. I wish I could tell you that leaving was the hardest part. But the truth, it was what came after. Back then, I didn't pack up and run away because I wanted to. I left because I had to. I had a newborn baby, a body still recovering from surgery, and a heart that was barely holding itself together. And while I was bleeding, physically and emotionally, they were writing the story without me. They didn't ask why I left. They didn't care to know that the man I married, the one they never liked, had become someone else entirely. Someone loud, angry, dangerous. I walked away not to abandon my father, but to protect my son. But you see, families like mine, they don't rewrite the story when you explain yourself. They just repeat the old one louder. And so they cut me out. Phone calls, holidays, even out of photos on the wall. Yes, literally. I remember visiting once, 2 years after I left. Aunt Carol's birthday. I walked in and saw a family portrait. The same one we took on Dad's porch after the 4th of July. Except, I wasn't in it anymore. I wasn't cropped out. They had printed a new version without me. That's when it hit me. To them I wasn't missing. Had been erased. Veronica, the sister who used to sneak into my room late at night to borrow my sweaters, became the narrator. She told people I left because I couldn't handle being a mother, that I chose chaos over family, and no one questioned it, not once, because it's easier to believe the girl who stays than the one who walks away. It didn't matter that I was working 2 jobs to feed my child, or that I sent birthday gifts to my father that were never acknowledged. I became the problem, the disappointment, the daughter no one spoke of, unless it was in a whisper. And that's why walking into that room today was like walking back into a trial I never asked for. But here's the thing. Sometimes we spend years trying to prove that we were worthy of love, when the real problem was, we were loving people who never knew how to hold our truth. And that was what made me hold Tyler's hand even tighter as the lawyer opened his briefcase. Because whether I left or stayed, they had already made up their minds. But they weren't the only ones who remembered. And what Tyler was about to reveal was going to unravel the story they spent years protecting. The night before the will reading, Tyler sat beside me on our worn-out couch. His favorite blanket wrapped around his legs, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, and that thoughtful, too-grown look in his eyes. He was quiet for a long time, just tracing the edges of a puzzle piece with his fingers. And then he said it, softly, almost like a secret. "Mom, if Grandpa still remembered you, don't you want to know?" I turned to him, startled. "Remembered me? I asked, confused. He nodded. Not everyone forgets the same way. Caught me off guard, because it wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. From an 8-year-old boy who'd been watching his mother pretend for years that the past didn't matter, that the silence didn't hurt. He didn't say more after that. He didn't have to. That night I barely slept. I lay awake thinking of that question, not about what it meant for him, but what it revealed about me. I had spent so long trying to prove I didn't need closure that I stopped wondering if maybe piece of me still did. So I got up the next morning, dressed in my most neutral blouse, not too formal, not too desperate, and held Tyler's hand as we walked into that room full of judgment. But I wasn't walking in alone this time. I was walking in because of the little boy beside me, who still believed that the truth was worth searching for. And here's the thing. Sometimes it takes someone who sees you without judgment to remind you that you still matter, even to the people who forgot how to show it. Tyler's question didn't just get me in that room. It opened a door in my heart I didn't know was still locked. And behind that door was a truth my father had left behind, quiet, hidden, waiting for the right hands to carry it into the light. And Tyler was already holding it. When the lawyer began reading, the room shifted. Suddenly everyone was sitting straighter, like they were waiting for lottery numbers instead of a farewell. Mr. Donald opened the folder slowly, his voice calm and deliberate, like a man who knew what he was about to say would shift something in the air. And it did. "To my eldest daughter Veronica," he said, "I leave the main house and all its contents." Veronica didn't smile, but the tilt of her chin said everything. She had already won. "To my brother Charles, he gets the cabin by the lake. To my nephew Ryan, the classic car collection." Items. Applause behind the eyes. Felt less like a will, and more like a well-rehearsed awards ceremony. And then, Mr. Donald paused. His eyes dropped down to the next line, and when he read it, he did so with a softness that made it worse. "And as previously stated, my youngest daughter Jessica shall receive no portion of this estate." There it was, the final cut. Clean, cold, public. No note, no explanation, not even a line saying goodbye. There was a brief silence, just long enough for the words to settle like dust. And then Veronica let out a short, smug laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, and everyone heard it. She leaned over to her husband and whispered, "I told you she was just here for a show." Across the table, Uncle Charles chuckled under his breath. "Some people never learn," he muttered. "They always come back thinking they're owed something." I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, while Tyler looked up at me, confused but quiet. And that hurt more than anything else. 'Cause children, they understand silence better than we think. And in that moment, my son was learning something I never wanted him to feel. What it's like to be cast aside by the people who should have held you close. Kept my voice steady. I leaned down and whispered, "It's okay. We're still okay." And we were. Because what no one at that table knew was that I hadn't come to collect anything. I hadn't come to beg. I came to see for myself whether I had truly been erased, or if somewhere, somehow, there was still a piece of truth left behind. Here's the lesson I learned that day. Being forgotten in someone's will hurts less than being forgotten in their heart. But even then, there are some things paper can't erase, and some stories that refuse to stay buried, especially when they're not over yet. And mine was just about to take a turn no one in that room saw coming. I was about to gather my things, not out of shame, but because there was nothing left to wait for. They'd had their say. No, I'd been officially, publicly, and permanently erased. But then, just as the tension in the room began to dissolve into small talk and estate planning, Tyler tugged on my sleeve. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't rushed, but it was clear. "You forgot the video," he said, his little voice cutting through the air like sunlight through a storm. Everyone froze. Veronica stiffened. My uncle looked confused. Even Mr. Donald furrowed his brow. "What video?" I whispered, barely audible. Tyler didn't look at me. His gaze was steady on Mr. Donald. From his small backpack, he pulled out a white envelope, carefully sealed with brown tape. On the front, in my father's bold, unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "For Mr. Donald. Only if it gets ugly." My breath caught. My hand shook. I recognized that writing. Like I would recognize the sound of my father's voice in a crowd. "Tyler," I whispered, "where did you get this?" He finally turned to me. His face calm, grounded, almost grown. "The last time I visited Grandpa," he said. "He gave it to me. Told me to keep it safe. Said to give it to Mr. Donald. If people forgot something important." That moment, that single sentence, shifted the room on its axis. Suddenly, all the certainty around that table wasn't so certain anymore. Veronica's face went pale. My uncle leaned forward. Even Edward, who hadn't looked at me once, put down his phone. And Tyler, my son, my little boy with a backpack full of crayons and truth, had just pulled the thread that would unravel the entire story. Here's the truth people often overlook. Children may be small, but they are powerful keepers of memory. They know when something's wrong. And more often than not, they know when it's time to speak. Tyler had carried that envelope for months, quietly, without asking questions, without seeking attention, just waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect anyone. Now, he had chosen his moment, and with it, he cracked open a truth none of them were prepared to face. Because what was inside that envelope wasn't just a message, was a voice, one they thought they'd silenced, one they believed was buried with the man who'd written it. But what they didn't realize was that sometimes, even the dead still have something left to say. Before we continue, I want to pause for just a moment, because I know many of you watching this might feel something stirring inside. Maybe anger, maybe sadness, or maybe a quiet memory of a time you were left out, misunderstood, or erased. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in Jessica's shoes? Have you ever had to carry the truth silently like Tyler did, just waiting for the right moment to be heard? If any part of this story speaks to your heart, drop a comment below. Tell us how you feel. Your words might help someone else feel a little less alone today. Alright, let's get back to the story. 'Cause what happens next will change everything. Mr. Donald held the envelope with both hands, his expression suddenly heavier. He opened it carefully, as if whatever was inside could change the weight of the air in the room. And maybe, in a way, it did. Inside, a single USB drive, and a folded letter in my father's handwriting. He scanned the letter in silence, then looked up slowly. His voice was different this time, lower, gentler, like he wasn't just reading legal instructions anymore. He was holding something sacred. "This is a video recording," he said quietly, "made by Mr. Jefferson before he finalized his last will. He instructed me to play it only if the reading became contentious." He glanced around the room. And I guess that's exactly what today had become. Without another word, he walked over to the small table at the side of the room, plugged in the USB, and opened the only file inside. The screen flickered, and then, there he was, my father, Harold Jefferson, sitting at his old desk, wearing the cardigan I gave him one Christmas, the one he swore he'd never wear, because it was too soft. Silver hair neatly combed, his tired, clear. The room went completely still. Even the ones who had scoffed were now holding their breath. And then he spoke. "If you're watching this, Jessica, then things didn't go the way I hoped. And I'm sorry. I felt the words hit something in my chest I didn't know was still tender. He continued, slow, deliberate, no lawyer in sight. Just a man who had realized too late that pride and love don't live well together. I know you're being left out of the will. At the time I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought you abandoned me. I believed what people said, that you were selfish, disrespectful, ungrateful. But the older I got, the more I wondered, why didn't I ever ask you myself? My hands trembled. Beside me, Tyler squeezed my fingers tighter. And then came the words I had never expected to hear. I met Tyler, he said, his voice softening. And when I asked him about you, he looked at me and said, my mom is the safest place in the world. Closed my eyes. The tears didn't fall fast. They fell slow, like years finally letting go. And for the first time in my life, I heard my father speak my name. Not with disappointment, but with love. Jessica, he said, when you came back with your son, I watched you from the window. You stood there in the rain, and I didn't open the door. I thought you owed me an apology, but now I see. I was the one who failed you. The room was silent, not in awkwardness, but in awe. No one spoke, no one moved, because even they knew this wasn't about property anymore. It was about truth, about healing. You didn't walk away because you were weak, he said. You walked away because you were brave. You protected your child. You protected yourself. And you did it without anyone standing behind you. And then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'm proud of you, Jessica. And I'm sorry for not knowing how to love you better when you needed it most. Those words undid something in me. Not because they fixed everything, but because they saw everything. Here's what I learned in that moment. Sometimes the most powerful apology isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, honest, and late, but it's still healing. And then, as if he knew what would come next, my father said the one thing that would shatter every assumption in that room. I revised my will. The final version is with Mr. Donald. I leave everything, the house, the savings, and a scholarship fund for Tyler. You, Jessica, 'cause you deserve it. Because the truth finally caught up with me. The screen began to fade, but just before it went black, he looked directly into the camera and said with the softest, most human voice, you are my daughter, and I love you. I always have. I just didn't know how to show it. And just like that, he was gone. But the story, the one they thought was finished, it had just been rewritten. When the screen faded to black, no one moved. Not a word, not a breath. It felt like the kind of silence that only shows up after something holy has been said. And then, the world started turning again. Veronica's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up abruptly, her face pale but burning with something. Pride, rage, maybe fear. No way, she whispered. But her voice cracked at the edges. He never changed the will. I took care of him. I was there. Every day. No one answered her. Not even her husband, who reached for her arm, only to be pushed away. She stormed out, the door slamming behind her. Like punctuation. No, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel anything loud. Just quiet. The kind that settles deep in your bones. When something long buried finally sees the light. My uncle sat still. His arms crossed tightly across his chest, eyes glued to the USB drive, like it had just rearranged everything he thought was true. How do we even know that video was real? He muttered. He could have recorded that while confused. He wasn't thinking clearly. Mr. Donald didn't flinch. It was time-stamped 2 weeks before he passed, he said calmly. I was present when he signed the revised will. Everything is legal, witnessed, and notarized. No one had a response. Because when the truth walks into a room, excuses tend to walk out. Across the table, Edward, my cousin, the one who once laughed at me under his breath, now sat frozen. He looked at me, not with contempt, but something closer to disbelief. "I didn't think he'd actually do it," he said softly, almost to himself. He stood up, quietly grabbed his coat, and walked out without looking back. Others followed, some in silence, some with stiff nods, none with apologies, and I stayed seated, not because I didn't know I could leave, but because, for the first time in a very long time, I didn't need to. Here's something I've learned. Sometimes you don't get justice from the people who hurt you. You get it from the truth, from the undeniable evidence that you were never the villain in their version of the story. You were just the one who left the story they tried to trap you in. I didn't need them to say sorry. I didn't need them to suddenly love me. What I needed was to hear the one voice that had once shut the door say finally, "I see you." And now that I had it, everything else could fall away. The inheritance, yes, it mattered, but not because of the money, because of what it represented. Recognition, redemption, truth made visible. And as the room emptied, and the sound of shoes on wood faded down the hallway, I looked over at Tyler. His eyes were soft, his small hand still holding mine, and I knew he had carried a secret so that I could carry peace. After the room emptied, only 3 of us remained. Me, Tyler, and Mr. Donald. The weight of everything, years of silence, rejection, pain, hung in the air for one final breath, before slowly lifting. Mr. Donald gently closed the folder. His voice was lower now, more like a friend than a lawyer. "The revised will is legally binding," he said. "It goes into effect immediately. We'll send out the paperwork next week." I nodded, but I couldn't find words just yet, because the truth is, I didn't feel like shouting, or dancing, or rubbing anything in anyone's face. Felt still, whole, peace. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, the kind that settles in your chest, like warm tea on a cold morning. I looked around the room where my father taught me how to tie my shoes, fold paper airplanes, and count stars through the window on stormy nights. This used to be the place where I felt most unwanted, but today, it felt like it had opened its arms, like it had finally said, "Welcome back." Tyler was still sitting beside me, his small hand in mine, his eyes scanning the ceiling, like he was memorizing the feeling of peace. I leaned down and whispered, "You did good, kiddo." "Thank you." He smiled and nodded, like he already knew. We stepped outside together, the afternoon sun casting soft gold across the front porch. The house looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Tyler turned to me, his voice small but curious. "Do you want to see Grandpa's room?" Paused, looked at the front door, felt the wind move through the trees like a gentle reminder, and I said, "Not today. Today I just want to go home with you." And that's what we did. We walked down the steps, past the stone path, toward the car that had carried us here, expecting nothing. And as I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, I didn't see the girl who left this house in tears years ago. I saw a woman, a mother, someone who had been hurt, but never broken. Here's the truth I carried home that day. Sometimes the justice you wait for won't come in words. It'll come in actions, in moments of recognition, in the peace of knowing you no longer have to prove yourself to people who never tried to understand you in the first place. I didn't need my father to be perfect. I just needed him to see me. And he did, in the way he knew how. He gave me more than a house. He gave me a chance to stop running from who I was and start building something new. For me, and for Tyler. A home that wasn't handed to me, but earned, through love, through truth, and through the quiet courage of us. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of Jessica's journey. It wasn't just about a will. It was about being seen, finally. About reclaiming your worth. Even when everyone else tries to write you out of the story. If there's one lesson we can take from this, it's this. The truth has a way of rising, even after years of silence, even through the smallest voice. And love, real love, doesn't always show up loud, but when it finally speaks, it heals. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Tell us what part stayed with you. How did it make you feel? Your words might inspire someone else who needs to hear this today. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you won't miss the next story that might speak to your heart just like this one did. Until then, take care, hold on to your truth, and remember, you are never too forgotten to be remembered again. Showing up anyway,